This is World to Win, bringing you the latest news and analysis from a socialist perspective. Welcome back, everyone, to World to Win. My name is Toya, and I'm here with my co-host, Yara. We have an exciting episode this week, like always, but I want to thank everyone who subscribed to our channel. And be sure to like this video and share it, especially if you have family or friends that live in Latin America, because we're going to be talking about it today. And if you yourself live in Latin America, make sure you share this video with all of your neighbors, coworkers, family. But today we're going to be discussing the current state of things there, especially around the new developments in Peru and in Guatemala, and also checking in about Chile, which we talked about a few weeks ago. We'll have one of our favorite guests on, André from LSR in Brazil. But first, before we get to André, I want to hear from Victor, who you might remember from a few months back. He just ran a very exciting campaign for a city councilor in Brazil, in a city called Natal. And so we're going to talk to him again. He ran on the PSOL line with the PSOL party, along with many other candidates across the country. But before we get into the specifics about his campaign, I want to know a little bit more about the general situation in Brazil. So Victor, can you talk about what's going on in Brazil right now, the strengthening of the traditional right wing? We have the Workers' Party there called PT, which is in crisis. And what does this mean for the working class and for activists in Brazil right now?
Here in Brazil, we're having such different elections this year. Of course, we have the defeat in some aspects of Bolsonaro's candidates, a certain or relative strengthening of the traditional right wing, and we had also the crisis of PT being manifested in these elections, and great opportunity to be solved in this scenario. For example, if we consider the 59 candidates that Bolsonaro explicitly supported this year, he only managed to elect 13. There are two mayors of city in the countryside and 11 city councilors. In Rio, if we consider even Crivella, he has bad rates in the second round until today. And if we talk about Russomano in São Paulo, has been banished from the second round. So Bolsonaro former party, PSL, became too small in these elections again, totally different from 2018. If we talk about the traditional right wing, at some point we check, we're getting a relative growth of this, but they're not even close to what they have, to what they had when we are talking about a PT governments some years ago. They grow a little bit, but it's not even close to what they had. So we cannot talk about this growth of the traditional right wing as something really concrete here in Brazil. Of course, they are old electoral machines based on patronage, colonialism, and vote buying. So that's why they have more votes every elections. However, we cannot consider as a meaningful growth of the right-wing parties, considering their historical numbers. In these elections, PT did not recover from the collapse experienced last years. In spite of being of the parties with strong capillarity throughout the country, PT fell from 256 city halls won in 2016 to 178 in these elections. When we talk about PSOL and our participation in these elections, we grew in a huge numbers of councillors from 53 to 88 in great cities, in large cities here in Brazil. In Rio de Janeiro, for example, PSOL elected 7 councillors and tripled its number in São Paulo. About 40% of these participations of these victories were women, and 48% were Black people. So also elected 4 trans women in city councils, the first 2 trans councillors in capitals belonging to our party. So it's clear that we have great opportunities to a socialist movement, especially linked to the oppressive struggles in our country and these elections and in the future struggles we have to build in next years.
So I wanted to ask you specific quickly about the campaign in Natal. Like, what were the main points in the campaign? How did it go? And I was also wondering, like, how did you organize in the campaign?
Okay, here in Natal, which is one of the capitals of the states here in Brazil, in our northeast, we organized this campaign last year because we were evaluating that we had this space for the socialist movement in here. Even though PT here is very strong, even though here PSOL is not that so strong. But in spite of this scenario, we reached to organize the social movements, some unions supporting our campaign, and we organized hundreds and hundreds of these social activists organizing this campaign with us. In here, PSOL tried to make some of sabotage with our campaign because we are not the main candidate they wanted to support. So we received less money than most of the candidates the party had supported. There were 29 candidates about. But even though we reached with this movement, connected with the social movement, the biggest crowdfunding in PSOL in our states was from our campaign. We reached more than 25,000 reais here through this movement, with more than 100 donators who donated more than once for our campaign. And we're living in a crisis, financial crisis, especially if we talk about our state, which is one of the poorest here in Brazil. But we talked about socialism. We talked about budget, the city budget, which is totally organized to big companies, which do not contest the debits of these companies. So we talked about this in our campaign. We talked about education, 100% public, free, universal, inclusive, democratic, and with social quality, because we do not have here in our state. We talked about culture policies as a human right and a popular resistance struggle here. So we reach in our campaign a lot of supporters from artists, cultural producers who talk to us, recognize in our campaign this force to fight with them. And now they are trying to, they're reaching us because they want to know our LSR, they want to know the PSOL, they want to join our struggles, our fights beyond elections. We also, in this movement, talked about oppressions because we are LGBT, women, Black people in our organization here. So that's why we had the main part of the LGBT movement organized with us and supporting our campaign. Unfortunately, in this path, we didn't achieve the electoral winning, the electoral victory, but of course we have reached the political ones. This Saturday, we organized our a meeting to talk with these activists about PSOL, about LSR, about ISA, and our struggles. And most of them are will to get to our movements beyond elections. So that's why we think that being the third position in these elections, considering the candidates, considering the scenario in here, was a great victory and inspire us to keep fighting, not just for elections, of course, but especially to organize these people who were together with us and will keep together with us from the, we hope, from the next days and the next periods and fights.
Thank you so much. Every time you finish an answer, I just want to clap. Like, it's so inspiring, so amazing. And like, I want to ask you generally about, LSR's participation in the elections. Like, how was it like in the regions that the LSR participated in, and also like what other campaigns were really, really important? Because you've done amazingly in these elections. So I want to hear more.
Well, it's really difficult because we are a small organization, but as we say, sometimes if you are small but you are organized, we can reach great challenges better than if you are great and you don't organize themselves. So we discussed a lot our participation in these elections. We projected different organizations, prioritized the campaigns in Natal and São Paulo, but also we had campaigns in Rio. We were like vice candidates for mayor. We had campaigns in Goiás. We supported for other organizations here in Recife, which is close to Natal. We also were supporting Black candidates. So we participated in these movements in a certain with a huge force, of course, considering our size. And it was really great, this campaign, because I think it was one of the first campaigns of LSI that we were there to reach also electoral victory. So our feelings during this process, even we are living in a pandemic with a lot of problems, a lot of difficulties, even to organize campaigns, but we were on the streets with sanitary protections, of course, but talking to people, talking to working class people, especially the oppressed one, the poor one, who are really, really, really angry with the system, really, really angry with this political system, especially the traditional wing, but also PT. We talk to these people in the eyes, trying to reach them and understand what we can do, not just in the campaign, not just in the elections, but from now on to connect these people to our struggles. And it's really special because yesterday, or the day before yesterday, I received a message from women who works here on the streets selling fruits, and we talked to them during the election, and they voted with us during the election. They were saying, Victor, we were really happy with your result. Of course, we wanted you to win, but we need you all together to keep fighting with us, because they want this pandemic again to take us from the streets without any social policy for us to be at home. So we don't want to, of course, they said to me, and it was really strong, of course, we don't want to die with the virus, but we also don't want to die with hunger. So please help us to organize this struggle, because we don't want to be repressed by police again. So this force shows the potential of the elections here in Brazil and the potential of our organization if we really organize these fights and these struggles with this sense of future, not just worrying about the elections.
This is really incredible. And I think it also shows that what you just, like the story, the anecdote that you just told us, just shows that what we mean when we when we go on election campaigns as socialists, it's not the aim is not necessarily to get that the thing that we're standing in election for. It's to mobilize the masses. It's to support the struggles of the masses. And I think that's something that we consistently do in the International Socialist Alternative everywhere we stand in elections, whether we win or not. And I think that sentiment and that, knowing that people, we know the working class people can see the victories that mass movements have. They can see the victories that organizing can win. And I think that is the main benefit of socialists standing in elections and standing on a socialist platform, and showing the masses that they have people who can help them organize, and they have organizations that are there for them, and not just in name, but also actively working on the streets. And to connect to that, I wanted to ask you a little bit about, you mentioned the elections in Sao Paulo, and I heard about Belém as well. That I want to ask you about, first of all, the importance of Sol participating in the second round. First of all, what does that mean for candidates, and also what do we need to win? And I think maybe the main question that I want to ask is, how is it going to help us build that mass left socialist alternative that we were talking about here, and kind of what's the role of LSR within building that?
Well, Edmilson and Boulos are technically tied to their opponents here in Brazil in this second round elections. We still do not have the results. We have work to win, making alliance with other left-wing parties, especially with social movements, unions, and especially with a radical program when we talk about Boulos, especially. And we had participation in this, not just in these elections, but throughout the years. We are building together this revolutionary and socialist pole inside PSOL. We have reached youth, especially the oppressed part of the working class, and it's very, very significant. But it's not enough. It's not enough. To continue growing and strengthening this left-wing alternative, which is PSOL, and especially the PSOL we want to build through LSR, through the organizations sharing this socialist and revolutionary program inside the party. It's essential that we keep doing this beyond elections and even during the elections, talking about not just about abstract socialism, but the problems people live and how socialists respond to these programs and problems. And we're doing this in São Paulo. We're talking about taxing the richest people in Brazil, which was not a very how can I say, a very nice topic in elections some years ago. But we're talking about this. We're talking about the poor people and their needs. We're talking about how it's unfair that São Paulo, for example, we have lots of mansions and money as in California, but we have people dying on the streets without shelter, without a house. So we are talking about this during this campaign because we are socialists. We're not in the elections just to win. We are in the elections to talk about our problems and to mobilize people to understand that capitalism cannot be the solution for our problems. So we are doing this in São Paulo, for example, in other cities like Belém, but more in São Paulo. And we have to keep this profile connecting to the social movements, connecting to the youth people, connecting to the poor people, trying to make our program, our proposals simple to understand. And it's getting simple to understand. We are talking on internet with YouTubers, with digital influencers in this campaign, and kids and teenagers are understanding, but we're also on the streets talking in the favelas, and they are understanding. Of course, we're facing a system who buys votes, and Covas in São Paulo was suspected this week to buy votes through food, in change of food, and we're living in a crisis. So of course, people sometimes tend to accept this kind of things, but we believe that the rebellion we are living inside people is close to come to outside here in Brazil. We have lots of things, and we are sure the Sol and LSR has a great opportunity and role in this movement to direct and conduce these people and these activists, not just inside the Sol, but outside the Sol especially.
It's so outrageous to hear what you're saying. Like the same politicians, the same people in the ruling class that have caused people to go hungry are using that to buy votes. It's absolutely outrageous. And I think what you said about how the position in the elections is about organizing, it's about showing an alternative. And I think also what you were saying about how these ideas can be presented in the most simple way, and should be, because it's not an academic topic. It's something that can actually change the lives of millions of people. And I think essentially these are very simple ideas that we're talking about. We're not talking about anything that no one can understand, because they are instinctive things. Like, we want equality. We want, if there's enough money in the country, why are the people starving? I think this is a very simple idea that we should be pushing. And it's so amazing to hear the work that you're doing in Brazil, and so interesting to hear about the election. But also, I love how we're not just talking about the election. We're talking about their role in moving towards an actual tangible change that can only happen when we change the system and we challenge it. So thank you so much, Victor, for speaking to us today.
You're welcome. Great to be here with you.
Yes, I want to move to kind of the rest of the continent now. And, last time we had André on the show, we spoke about events in Bolivia and the electoral triumph, which kind of saw the Bolivian working class reject the politics of the right. And that was something that was celebrated by the left throughout the region and I think the world as well. But in the last month, we've seen that this was not the end of it. It was barely the start of it. We've seen kind of like it was part of a broader process of radicalization and also political polarization and explosive events that were taking place across the continent of Latin America. And at the end of last month, we've seen the referendum in Chile, where the neoliberal constitution of the Pinochet era was completely abolished. And that is obviously a major victory for people in Chile and also kind of like an inspiration for everyone around the world. And then this month in Peru, we witnessed tens of thousands come out on the streets against the illegitimate impeachment of the president. And then in recent days, we've seen Guatemala that's been rocked by protests against the most recent government budget. So genuinely in every part of Latin America, we've seen mass rising against various things. So before talking about each specific country, I think it's important that we kind of put the events in context. And I know that at the end of 2019, there were mass movements in Ecuador, in Colombia, in Chile, that had kind of a character of revolts against neoliberalism in general. And we've seen the enough is enough protests of the enormous inequality that plagues the region. But since then, it seems to have only gone worse due to the pandemic. I think we've seen it around the world as well, but particularly in a continent like Latin America. And the pandemic and the economic crisis that were going hand in hand kind of made everything much worse. So why do you think 2019 was so important for the working class throughout Latin America? And what's changed since then? Why are we seeing these movements still happening?
Well, yeah, in fact, 2019 was a very important year. It was a turning point in the political dynamics of Latin America. As you know, we have had more than a decade with progressive left or center-left governments in many countries. But with the end of the commodity boom, the worsening of the economic crisis, and the inability of these governments to present an anti-capitalist and socialist alternative, the right wing has regained the political initiative in many countries. We saw a resurgence of the right wing with elections victories, but also some coup d'etat in some countries. This affected, for example, countries like Paraguay, Argentina, Venezuela, when the right wing won the majority in the National Assembly, Brazil, Ecuador, Chile, Uruguay, Bolivia. There was, in fact, a counterattack by the right wing with the support of imperialism throughout the region. But that right-wing offensive had the feet of clay, as we can say. So the working class had not been completely defeated, and the right had nothing more to offer than more crisis, neoliberal attacks, withdrawal of rights, and strong repression. So the answer would come soon or later with more struggles, and that, in fact, was what happened. We had many struggles in Latin America in 2019. The year began with the strike of the maquilas workers in Matamoros, industrial workers in Matamoros in north of Mexico. You know, Yara, that Toya, for example, know well about the mass struggle in Puerto Rico. She was there. But we also had Honduras, Haiti, Argentina, which culminated in the electoral defeat of Macri. We had a general strike that led to a journey of mass struggles in Colombia also against the ultra-right government of Ivan Duque. But the highlight was the social explosion in Ecuador and the mass uprising in Chile. The pandemic had an effect in terms of containing the mobilization for a period. Governments throughout the regions also try to use the pandemic as a justification for further repression, the prohibition of mobilization, etc. So the problem is that, as everywhere, the pandemic has greatly aggravated the problems that already existed and caused the 2019 mobilizations. So mass unemployment, poverty, inequality, the collapse of public services, the lack of legitimacy of governments causing serious political crisis. So the result has been a resurgence of struggles in varying degrees in the countries that already had mass struggles in 2019. But we have already discussed it here in World to Win, and you referred to this. We had the incredible process in Bolivia, a mass struggle followed by an electoral defeat by the right wing that promoted the coup in 2019. And in Chile, the struggle culminated in the popular victory in the plebiscite to change the Pinochet constitution of the country. But other countries have also begun to mobilize, and I want to highlight here the seriousness of the crisis in Peru, with a new generation of young people fighting on the streets, and also the recent mobilizations in Guatemala, because these two countries point to processes that tend to become even more widespread in Latin America in the next period.
Yeah, I think like you just started talking about Peru a little bit, and I want to ask you a few questions about that. So I think there was kind of like a demand for a constituent assembly in Peru, and there's been kind of like a deep political crisis like you described. And I think Peru has made headlines in the last number of months for other reasons. So we also saw the kind of highest death rate per capita for COVID as well in Peru. So I was wondering what's behind the recent attempts to impeach Vizcarra, and why have tens of thousands of protesters come out on the street to to demonstrate?
Well, in fact, Peru is experiencing a deep crisis of the whole political regime established with the 1993 constitution adopted under the government of Alberto Fujimori. Fujimori ruled the country as a dictator throughout the 1990s decade and combined radical neoliberalism and harsh repression of social movements. And since then, despite the high rates of economic growth in previous years, reflecting the commodity boom, the public services, including health, have only worsened and inequality has only increased. So this was reflected recently in the pandemic, as you said, which was particularly severe in Peru. Peru is today in second place in the world in number of deaths per capita by COVID-19. So this scenario has deepened the permanent instability and political crisis in the country. This has also been helped by recurrent cases of corruption. Corruption is a structural problem in capitalism that is even more serious in Latin America. All the presidents of the country since the fall of Fujimori in the year 2000 have been accused and convicted of corruption. Some are still in prison, and another one, Alan Garcia, for example, committed suicide just before going to prison. So in the last 4 years, Peru has had 4 presidents, and 3 of them in the same week. So Pedro Paulo Kuczynski was elected in 2016 with an anti-corruption rhetoric, but ended up resigning in 2018 because of the imminent impeachment by Congress on corruption charges. His vice president, Martin Vizcarra, also is a right-wing politician, assuming the presidency in conflict with the majority of the Congress, or Fujimorist, linked with the Keiko Fujimori, the daughter of Alberto Fujimori. So he ended up closing the Congress, but the new Congress elected also voted his impeachment on November 10 of November. So the then president of the Congress, Manuel Merino, took over the presidency, but there was an enormous popular reaction that, and this is important, was not demonstrations in defense of the former President Vizcarra, but in repudiation of the whole corrupt political system, the Congress, and the bourgeois politicians. So when the youth took to the streets, the repression was brutal. Two young people, Inti Sotelo and Brian Pintado, were brutally murdered by the police. So together with many other wounded, and some people disappeared. So these young demonstrators are called the heroes of the bicentennial, in reference to the new generation of young people who are entering the struggle massively on the eve of the bicentennial of the Peru's independence, which will be celebrated in July next year. So in the same day that the young activists were murdered, 6 days after taking office, Merino resigned, and a power vacuum was created for some time. So the Congress then elected by a majority a new president, Francisco Sagasti, with a more conciliatory rhetoric, aimed specifically at pacifying the streets and preparing the ground for the elections to be held in April next year. But the claim, the clamor of the streets is not only to elect a new president. So the whole political system is being repudiated, and the 1993 constitution itself, the result of an authoritarian government, is being questioned. So the divisions and inter-bourgeois conflicts have ended up opening space for popular mobilization. So in fact, the divisions above already reflected a strong pressure from below, and a kind of a powder keg about to explode. So the most important thing at this time, I think, is to have no illusions in any rhetoric of national reconciliation on the part of the new president Sagasti. So it's important to note that his vice president is from the Frente Amplio, the broad front, which is a formation with the center-left and left-wing sectors within it, a formation that came 30 in the 2016 presidential elections. And this can provoke some illusions, but this represents a capitulation of these sectors of the Frente Amplio in this political process. So the way out from the workers' point of view is to maintain the struggles, strengthen the organizations of workers, peasants, and indigenous peoples, and fight for a new constitution in the country that will overthrow the current political and also economic system.
It's so interesting to see how these processes of basically instability of the ruling class and neoliberalism in general are so global. And I think we've seen it massively in Latin America, but we've seen it all around the world. Like, I personally thought that the winner of the instability was Israel, with 3 elections in 1 year. But I think Peru and generally quite a lot of countries in Latin America take that title away. And I think you talked a little bit about kind of the constitutional changes that need to happen. And I want to kind of move to talk about Chile, that had those constitutional changes happen, because I think the plebiscite last month obviously was part of kind of like a bigger and even worldwide movement of protests to at the end of 2019. And I think it's also like, it looks like a big victory for the movement, like the victory in the plebiscite. And I was wondering if you can tell us, first of all, why it was so important, and also kind of what the changes will actually mean for workers, for young people, and the oppressed in Chile.
Well, the plebiscite, in fact, was a very big achievement of the mass movement that exploded a year earlier. The last thing that went through the minds of President Piñera and the Chilean elites was to open a process of changing the constitution. So they were forced to do so by the mass movement. So the outcome of the plebiscite makes it clear that the immense majority, we are talking about almost 80% of the voters, repudiates the constitution of Pinochet, but also that this overwhelming majority repudiates the current Congress and the current politicians and wants the new constitution to be drafted with democracy and popular participation. So changing the constitution means not only burying once and for all the remnants of the Pinochet's dictatorship, but also the farce of the democratic transition and the so-called democratic government of the last 30 years. But that process is still far from over. There are concrete obstacles and limits to achieving a true constitution that reflects the interest of the majority of the people, workers, indigenous people, women, young people, etc. First of all, Piñera must fall. He was responsible for the repression last year, repression that still exists under the pretext of the pandemic, etc. There are around 2,000 political prisoners of the 2019 mass uprising that need to be released, and those responsible for the repression need to be punished. Also, the institutional limits imposed by the agreement with the opposition made in October last year must be removed. For example, one of them is the necessity of the 2/3 majority for the approval of any measures in the new constitution, in the new constituent convention. This, in practice, can offer a veto power to the right and to the defenders of the current order. What the mass movement cannot accept in this current strategy of the ruling class, which is what the ruling class is trying to do, is change everything in order not to change anything. So the movement cannot admit that the electoral process that will come next year, election of representatives of for the Constituent Convention, municipal and general elections, that this process serve to contain the mobilization in the streets and channel the whole process into safe institutional channels for the ruling class. It's necessary to continue in the street, mobilize it, and only the continuity of the mobilizations of the working class and the oppressed with grassroots organizations can guarantee a real change. So people assemblies in the neighborhoods and workplaces must multiply. We need to multiply the experience that already exists and serve as the basis of a kind of a people power from below that must be reflected in the constituent process. So the constituent process offers an enormous opportunity for a reorganization of the workers and social movements in Chile and of the left itself, and paving the way for a socialist alternative that needs to be built in this process.
Thank you, André. I think it's so inspirational, and what you're saying, I think, is really, really true when it comes to, anything that the capitalists do is trying to maintain their system. So just winning like a victory doesn't mean that it's going to be maintained. And also, especially in a time like this, it's really important that we, kind of make sure that the victory stays a victory and can gain as much as possible for the working class, the oppressed, and the young people in Chile and in the continent. And I think it also leads me to another country in the region that kind of had a lot of like havoc wreaked around it, which is Guatemala, which we've seen recently that not only did they have an outbreak of COVID like every place around the world, but also they were hit by a hurricane, and that was completely devastating. And while that was happening, the government passed a budget that saw major cuts to public education and also to health. And like during a pandemic, during a hurricane, it's absolutely ridiculous. So understandably, that immediately sparked protests around the country. And I wanted to ask you if you can explain, first of all, why people are so angry, because there's anger and there is burning the Congress building down. And also kind of what type of movement do the people in Guatemala need to build and to kind of channel this anger to get actual victories and bring real change?
I think what has happened in Guatemala last week is a sign of what will continue to happen in Latin America and other parts of the world. Political and social crisis aggravated by the pandemic and other factors related to poverty and inequality. The protests in Guatemala began on November 19th and peaked on last Saturday, November 21. So they were mainly against the approval by the Congress in a secret session of a budget that involved incentives for big business, and also cuts in spending on education, human rights, and health during a pandemic, and also, as you said, the aftermath of hurricanes Eta and Iota. In addition to the 4,000 deaths from the pandemic, the hurricanes have so far left at least 60 dead, more than 100 missing people, and more than 2 million affected. They have also caused the evacuation of 275,000 people. So 60% of Guatemala's population lives below the poverty line. Child malnutrition has worsened with the pandemic and affects 1 in 2 children under 5 years of age. And the approved budget not only did not allocate any special investment to tackle this problem, but at the same time, it increased the resources allocated to the parliamentaries, to the food, for example, for the members of the Congress. So, of course, this is a provocation that has been responded by the anger shown in the streets. In the mobilizations in Ciudad de Guatemala, the capital of the country, a guillotine was symbolically used, and the Congress building was attacked and partially burned down. So very strong repression was launched by the government, with hundreds of injured, and the demonstrators hit in the eyes, as has been systematically done in countries like Chile recently. So the government eventually backed down on the budget proposed, which was a strong victory for the movement in the street. But the mobilizations also demand the immediate resignation of the president, Alejandro Giammattei, who is ultra-right wing politician aligned with Donald Trump, and who took office early this year, in January this year, in reality. So in the face of enormous popular pressure, for example, the vice president publicly proposed the resignation of both the president and vice president. So the political crisis continues, and that the process of a struggle must continue. And this demand of the overthrow of the government is in the center of this process. But I would like to stress that what we have seen in countries like Chile, Peru, and Guatemala, and in most Latin American countries, is that the structural problems that came from the dictatorships of the past and were not resolved by the weak bourgeois democracies of recent years, they are flaring up with the recent crisis and provoking radical responses from workers, peasants, indigenous people, and all oppressed sectors. So the level of polarization must be deepened, and the only way out is not to repeat the experience of the progressive governments that are committed to national reconciliation and class conciliation, but to a genuine socialist and revolutionary alternative for the region. Only Latin America united on a socialist basis can offer a way out for the peoples of the region and inspire workers and peoples from all over the world.
Thank you so much, André, for coming on our show again. We always love having you, and hopefully we'll see you again soon. Now for my favorite part of the show, the shout out of the week. We're commemorating November 25th, which was an International Day of Action against gender violence. We saw people across the globe standing out, doing pickets and striking, talking about the oppression of women and trans people. And it's super important to acknowledge that capitalism is the reason that we're seeing all of these things. And if we want to fight against gender oppression, if we want to fight against violence against women, we also have to be fighting against capitalism. We spoke a lot about this last week, so if you missed that episode, be sure to check it out after this one. But like I said, we had actions all around the globe. You can check it out on our website, the International Socialist Alternative website. And also, Campaign Rosa has a Facebook page. So you can check that out too and see all the pictures. It's really inspiring to see people around the world taking action. And even in Russia, in the super oppressive conditions, there was, some scuffles with the police. They were upset that, people were speaking out against gender violence, and it's just crazy. So be sure to check out our website and read our article that we posted about it. I want to thank everyone for tuning in today. Be sure to tune in next week. Like and subscribe to our channel. And I'll see you next week, same time, same place. This is World to Win. Every Sunday, we broadcast with speakers from across the globe, bringing you the latest news and analysis on the fast-moving global events from a socialist perspective. Subscribe to the International Socialist Alternatives YouTube page and click the bell to get notified when we go live for a new episode. Like us on Facebook and follow us on Instagram because there's a lot to do and we have a world to win.
When we fight! When we fight! When we fight! Solidarity!